A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 4. This is the fourth and the last empty MS book I can find in the house. At least nearly empty, for there are some pages of very ancient arithmetic at the end by J. I resolved to let this limit my jottings. I will not start buying books for the purpose, insofar as this record was a defense against total collapse, a safety valve. It has done some good. The other end I had in view turns out to have been based on a misunderstanding. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out to be not a state but a process. It needs not a map but a history, and if I don't stop writing that history at some quite arbitrary point, there's no reason why I should ever stop. There is something new to be chronicled every day. Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. As I've already noted, not every bend does. Sometimes the surprise is the opposite one. You are presented with exactly the same sort of country you thought you had left behind miles ago. That is when you wonder whether the valley isn't a circular trench. But it isn't. There are partial recurrences, but the sequence doesn't repeat. Here, for instance, is a new phase, a new loss. I do all the walking I can, for I'd be a fool to go to bed not tired. Today I have been revisiting old haunts, taking one of the long rambles that made me so happy in my bachelor days. And this time the face of nature was not emptied of its beauty, and the world didn't look, as I complained some days ago, like a mean street. On the contrary, every horizon, every stile or clump of trees summoned me into a past kind of happiness, my pre-H happiness. But the invitation seemed to me horrible. The happiness into which it invited me was insipid. I find that I don't want to go back again and be happy in that way. It frightens me to think that a mere going back should even be possible, for this fate would seem to me the worst of all. To reach a state in which my years of love and marriage should appear in retrospect a charming episode, like a holiday, that had briefly interrupted my interminable life and returned me to normal unchanged. And then it would come to seem unreal, something so foreign to the usual texture of my history that I could almost believe it had happened to someone else. Thus H would die to me a second time, a worse bereavement than the first. Anything but that. Did you ever know, dear, how much you took away with you when you left? You have stripped me even of my past, even of the things we never shared. I was wrong to say the stump was recovering from the pain of the amputation. I was deceived because it has so many ways to hurt me that I discover them only one by one. Still, there are the two enormous gains. I know myself too well now to call them lasting. Turned to God, my mind no longer meets that locked door. Turned to H, it no longer meets that vacuum, nor all that fuss about my mental image of her. My jotting shows something of the process, but not so much as I'd hoped. Perhaps both changes were really not observable. There was no sudden, striking and emotional transition, like the warming of a room or the coming of daylight. When you first notice them, they have already been going on for some time. The notes have been about myself, and about H, and about God, in that order. The order and the proportions exactly what they ought not to have been. And I see that I have nowhere fallen into that mode of thinking about either which we call praising them. Yet that would have been best for me. Praise is the mode of love which always has some element of joy in it. Praise in due order, of him as the giver, or her as the gift. Don't we in praise somehow enjoy what we praise, however far we are from it? I must do more of this. I have lost the fruition I once had of H. And I am far, far away in the valley of my unlikeness, from the fruition which, if his mercies are infinite, I may some time have of God. But by praising I can still in some degree enjoy her, and already in some degree enjoy him, better than nothing. But perhaps I lack the gift. I see I've described H as being a sword. That's true as far as it goes, but utterly inadequate by itself, and misleading. I ought to have balanced it. I ought to have said, but also like a garden, like a nest of gardens. Wall within wall, hedge within hedge, more secret, more full of fragrant and fertile life, the further you entered. And then of her and of every created thing I praise, I should say, in some way, in its unique way, like him who made it. Thus up from the garden to the gardener, from the sword to the smith, to the life-giving life and the beauty that makes beautiful. She is in God's hands. That gains a new energy when I think of her as a sword. Perhaps the earthly life I shared with her was only part of the tempering. Now perhaps he grasps the hilt, weighs the new weapon, makes lightnings with it in the air, a new Jerusalem blade. One moment last night can be described in similes. Otherwise it won't go into language at all. Imagine a man in total darkness. He thinks he is in a cellar or dungeon. Then there comes a sound. He thinks it might be a sound from far off, waves or wind-blown trees or cattle half a mile away. And if so, it proves he's not in a cellar but free, in the open air. Or it may be a much smaller sound close at hand, a chuckle of laughter, and if so, there is a friend just beside him in the dark. Either way, a good sound. I am not mad enough to take such an experience as evidence for anything. It is simply the leaping into imaginative activity of an idea, which I would always have theoretically admitted, the idea that I or any mortal at any time may be utterly mistaken as to the situation he is really in. 5 senses, an incurably abstract intellect, a haphazardly selective memory, a set of preconceptions and assumptions so numerous that I can never examine more than a minority of them, never become even conscious of them all. How much of total reality can such an apparatus let through? I will not, if I can help it, shin up either the feathery or the prickly tree. 2 widely different convictions press more and more on my mind. One is that the eternal vet is even more inexorable and the possible operations even more painful than our severest imaginings can forebode. But the other, that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. It doesn't matter that all the photographs of H are bad. It doesn't matter not much if my memory of her is imperfect. Images, whether on paper or in the mind, are not important for themselves, merely links. Take a parallel from an infinitely higher sphere. Tomorrow morning a priest will give me a little round, thin, cold, tasteless wafer. Is it a disadvantage? Is it not in some ways an advantage that it can't pretend the least resemblance to that with which it unites me? I need Christ, not something that resembles him. I want H, not something that is like her. A really good photograph might become in the end a snare, a horror, an obstacle. Images, I must suppose, have their use or they would not have been so popular. It makes little difference whether they are pictures and statuses outside the mind or imaginative constructions within it. To me, however, their danger is more obvious. Images of the holy easily become holy images, sacrosanct. My idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The Incarnation is the supreme example. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins, and most are offended by the iconoclasm, and blessed are those who are not. But the same thing happens in our private prayers. All reality is iconoclastic. The earthly beloved, even in this life, incessantly triumphs over your mere idea of her. And you want her to. You want her with all her resistances, all her faults, all her unexpectedness, that is, in her foursquare and independent reality. And this, not any image or memory, is what we are to love still, after she is dead. But this is not now imaginable. In that respect, H and all the dead are like God. In that respect, loving her has become in its measure like loving him. In both cases, I must stretch out the arms and hands of love. Its eyes cannot here be used to the reality through, across, all the changeful phantasmagoria of my thoughts, passions, and imaginings. I mustn't sit down content with the phantasmagoria itself and worship that for him, or love that for her. Not my idea of God, but God. Not my idea of H, but H. Yes, and also not my idea of my neighbor, but my neighbor. For don't we often make this mistake as regards people who are still alive, who are with us in the same room, talking and acting not to the man himself, but to the picture, almost the précis we've made of him in our own minds, and he has to depart from it pretty wildly before we even notice the fact. In real life, that's one way it differs from the novels. His words and acts are, if we observe closely, hardly ever quite in character. That is, in what we call his character. There's always a card in his hand we didn't know about. My reason for assuming that I do this to other people is the fact that so often I find them obviously doing it to me. We all think we've got one another tapped. And all this time I may, once more, be building with cards. And if I am, he will once more knock the building flat. He will knock it down as often as proves necessary, unless I have to be finally given up as hopeless and left building pasteboard palaces in hell forever, free among the dead. Am I, for instance, just sidling back to God because I know that if there's any road to H, it runs through him? But then, of course, I know perfectly well that he can't be used as a road. If you're approaching him not as the goal but as a road, not as the end but as a means, you're not really approaching him at all. That's what was really wrong with all those popular pictures of happy reunions on the further shore. Not the simple-minded and very earthly images, but the fact that they make an end of what we can get only as a byproduct of the true end. Lord, are these your real terms? Can I meet H again only if I learn to love you so much that I don't care whether I meet her or not? Consider, Lord, how it looks to us. What would anyone think of me if I said to the boys, "No toffee now, but when you've grown up and don't really want toffee, you shall have as much of it as you choose"? If I knew that to be eternally divided from H and eternally forgotten by her would add a greater joy and splendor to her being, of course I'd say, "Fire ahead." Just as if, on earth, I could have cured her cancer by never seeing her again, I'd have arranged never to see her again. I'd have had to. Any decent person would. But that's quite different. That's not the situation I'm in. When I lay these questions before God, I get no answer, but a rather special sort of no answer. It is not the locked door. It is more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze, as though he shook his head not in refusal, but waving the question like, "Peace, child, you don't understand." Can a mortal ask questions which God finds unanswerable? Quite easily, I should think. All nonsense questions are unanswerable. How many hours are there in a mile? Is yellow square or round? Probably half the questions we ask, half our great theological and metaphysical problems are like that. And now that I come to think of it, there's no practical problem before me at all. I know the great commandments, and I'd better get on with them. Indeed, H's death has ended the practical problem. While she was still alive, I could, in practice, have put her before God. That is, I could have done what she wanted instead of what he wanted. If there'd been a conflict, what's left is not a problem about anything I could do. It's all about weights of feelings and motives and that sort of thing. It's a problem I'm setting myself. I don't believe God set it me at all. The fruition of God. Reunion with the dead. These can't figure in my thinking except as counters, blank checks. My idea, if you can call it an idea, of the first is a huge, risky extrapolation from a very few and short experiences here on earth. Probably not such valuable experiences as I think. Perhaps even of less value than others that I take no account of. My idea of the second is also an extrapolation, the reality of either, the cashing of either check, would probably blow all one's ideas about both. How much more one's ideas about their relations to each other into smithereens. The mystical union on the one hand, the resurrection of the body on the other. I can't reach the ghost of an image, a formula, or even a feeling that combines them. But the reality, we are given to understand, does. Reality, the iconoclast, once more. Heaven will solve our problems, but not, I think, by showing us subtle reconciliations between all our apparently contradictory notions. The notions will all be knocked from under our feet. We shall see that there never was any problem. And more than once that impression which I can't describe except by saying that it's like the sound of a chuckle in the darkness, the sense that some shattering and disarming simplicity is the real answer. It is often thought that the dead see us, and we assume, whether reasonably or not, that if they see us at all, they see us more clearly than before. Does H now see exactly how much froth or tinsel there was in what she called, and I call, my love? So be it. Look your hardest, dear. I won't hide if I could. We didn't realize each other. We tried to keep no secrets. You knew most of the rotten places in me already. If you now see anything worse, I can take it. So can you. Rebuke, explain, mock, forgive, for this is one of the miracles of love. It gives, to both, but perhaps especially to the woman, a power of seeing through its own enchantments and yet not being disenchanted. To see, in some measure like God, His love and His knowledge are not distinct from one another, nor from Him. We could almost say He sees because He loves, and therefore loves although He sees. Sometimes, Lord, one is tempted to say that if you wanted us to behave like the lilies of the field, you might have given us an organization more like theirs. But that, I suppose, is just your grand experiment. Or no, not an experiment, for you have no need to find things out. Rather, your grand enterprise. To make an organism which is also a spirit, to make that terrible oxymoron a spiritual animal, to take a poor primate, a beast with nerve endings all over it, a creature with a stomach that wants to be filled, a breeding animal that wants its mate, and say, now get on with it. Become a god. I said several notebooks ago that even if I got what seemed like an assurance of H's presence, I wouldn't believe it. Easier said than done. Even now, though, I won't treat anything of that sort as evidence. It's the quality of last night's experience, not what it proves, but what it was, that makes it worth putting down. It was quite incredibly unemotional. Just the impression of her mind, momentarily facing my own. Mind, not soul as we tend to think of soul, certainly the reverse of what is called soulful. Not at all like a rapturous reunion of lovers, much more like getting a telephone call or a wire from her about some practical arrangement. Not that there was any message, just intelligence and attention, no sense of joy or sorrow, no love even in our ordinary sense, no unlove. I had never in any mood imagined the dead as being so. Well, so businesslike. Yet there was an extreme and cheerful intimacy, an intimacy that had not passed through the senses or the emotions at all. If this was a throw-up from my unconscious, then my unconscious must be a far more interesting region than the depth psychologists have led me to expect. For one thing, it is apparently much less primitive than my consciousness. Whether it came from, it has made a sort of spring cleaning in my mind. The dead could be like that, sheer intellects. A Greek philosopher wouldn't have been surprised at an experience like mine. He would have expected that if anything of us remained after death, it would be just that. Up to now, this always seemed to me a most arid and chilling idea. The absence of emotion repelled me, but in this contact, whether real or apparent, it didn't do anything of the sort. One didn't need emotion. The intimacy was complete, sharply bracing and restorative too, without it. Can that intimacy be love itself? Always in this life attended with emotion, not because it is itself an emotion or needs an attendant emotion, but because our animal souls, our nervous systems, our imaginations have to respond to it in that way? If so, how many preconceptions I must scrap! A society, a communion of pure intelligences would not be cold, drab, and comfortless. On the other hand, it wouldn't be very like what people usually mean when they use such words as spiritual, or mystical, or holy. It would, if I have had a glimpse, be, well, I'm almost scared at the adjectives I'd have to use. Brisk, cheerful, keen, alert, intense, wide awake, above all solid. Utterly reliable, firm. There is no nonsense about the dead. When I say intellect, I include will. Attention is an act of will. Intelligence in action is will par excellence. What seemed to meet me was full of resolution. Once, very near the end, I said, if you can, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed. Aloud, she said, heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. She knew she was speaking a kind of mythological language, with even an element of comedy in it. There was a twinkle as well as a tear in her eye, but there was no myth and no joke about the will, deeper than any feeling that flashed through her. But I mustn't, because I have come to misunderstand, a little less completely, what a pure intelligence might be, lean over too far. There is also, whatever it means, the resurrection of the body. We cannot understand. The best is perhaps what we understand least. Didn't people dispute once whether the final vision of God was more an act of intelligence or of love? That is probably another of the nonsense questions. How wicked it would be, if we could, to call the dead back. She said, not to me, but to the chaplain, "I am at peace with God." She smiled, but not at me. Poi si tornò alla eterna fontana.